In the seminar today, we're going to be continuing with foreign currency derivatives. The reading is Yun and Risnick, chapter 14, for the material we'll cover today. Chapter 7 was the material from last week. Okay, but remember this is seminar 5, covers all of these topics, but we've just divided it into 2 sections. So last week we talked about futures and forwards. We talked about options. Today we're going to talk about a different type of foreign currency derivative. We're going to talk about swaps. We're going to look at 2 cases of swaps. Now there are different, we will just look at these 2 examples. There are other ways that swaps can be set up, and we'll talk about that towards the end. But basically we're going to look at a single currency interest rate swap and a cross-currency interest rate swap. All right, so last week we looked at futures and forwards. Just a quick recap of what we did last week. So a currency forward or a future contract is a contract where you have an obligation to buy or sell an amount of currency, a specified amount of currency at a specified time in the future at an exchange rate determined now. So for example, we could have a futures contract where we lock in an exchange rate of $1.90 Australian dollars per US dollars. At the time of maturity, so at ST, the actual exchange rate might be different. It could be $2, it could be $1.80. If we had a long futures contract, so we're going to buy US dollars, then we would be better off if we had a contract to buy at $1.90. That's going to be cheaper for us to buy US dollars than if the spot rate ended up being $2. So we would have a benefit there. However, the disadvantage with futures is we've locked in that $1.90 rate. What if the rate actually at maturity ended up being $1.80? Well, then we've got a contract where we agree to pay $1.90, whereas it would have been much cheaper if we could just buy on the spot market at $1.80. If we were selling US dollars, or we had taken a short position, idea is the same, so we've locked in a rate of $1.90 per US dollars. With a short position, if the spot rate actually turns out to be less than the agreed upon futures rate, we end up better off. So we're going to receive $1.90 for each US dollar, whereas on the spot market we would have only received $1.80. However, if it turns out that the spot rate is higher than what we've locked in, we've actually, that's a disadvantage for us. So we've agreed to sell for $1.90, but actually we would have been better off selling on the spot market for $2. So the problem with futures is that you've locked in that rate, okay? An option gives the right but not the obligation to buy or sell the currency at a predetermined price called the strike price. A call option is a right to buy foreign currency, specifically to buy the denominator currency. And a put is the option to sell the denominator currency. Okay, so the call or the put, the foreign currency we're talking about, is the denominator currency. The nice thing about options is what? You don't have the downside risk. Okay, so with an option you don't have to exercise the option. If we look at option payoffs, the person that buys the option, who is the option holder, the payoff to a call option, so remember a call is an option to buy the foreign currency. So if it turns out that the spot price is higher than the exercise price, then the call option is in the money, so you've made a profit. If it turns out to be less, then you do not exercise the option, you let the option expire. On the other side of the option position is the option holder. They will receive the premium, and if it turns out that the spot price is greater than the exercise price, they end up making a loss. So they are the option holder on the other side of the option. For a put option, this is the option to sell the denominator currency. For a put option, if it turns out that the spot rate is less than the exercise price, the option is in the money, you make a profit. So the option has value. Otherwise, the option will lapse. You will not exercise the option. Similarly, if you are a put option writer, you will make a loss if the exercise price turns out to be greater than the current spot price. Okay, so that was a rapid run through futures and spots, futures and options, sorry. What we're going to be talking about today is swaps. Okay, so a swap is a contractual agreement to exchange periodic cash flows between two parties, right? So we're going to exchange cash flows, right? We're swapping cash flows. As I said, we're going to look at two different types of swaps. We're going to look at a single currency interest rate swap. So what's happening here is you have a floating rate and a fixed rate. Okay? So what happens with a single currency interest rate swap is that the two parties will swap floating rate debt for fixed rate debt. Okay? And the swap is in the same currency. We'll talk about what this means later, but just to give you the big picture. A cross-currency interest rate swap is where you have a swap between debt obligations in different currencies. All right, so you might swap an Australian dollar debt for a US dollar debt, denominated debt. Okay, so that's the basic idea of them. The swap bank is the institution that will help make the swap happen. Okay, that facilitates the swap between counterparties. They can serve either as a broker or a dealer. So we've seen these terms before. What a broker does is they match two parties. Okay, so a broker does not involve themselves in the transaction at all, but they just match two parties who want to transact. Okay, and why do they do that? Because they receive a commission. A swap bank can also act as a dealer. So what that means is that if you have a bank that is a dealer, they will trade directly with the customer. Okay, so a broker brings people together to transact. A dealer will transact directly with the customer themselves. All right, so let's have a look at these two types of swaps. So starting off with an interest rate swap. So we said an interest rate swap is we're going to swap a fixed rate debt obligations for a floating rate debt obligations. What does floating rate mean? A floating rate is a variable interest rate. Okay, so as interest rates change, as underlying interest rate change, the amount that you have to pay will change as well. Okay, so a floating rate or a variable rate. So Bank A is a AAA rated international bank located in the UK. They wish to raise $10,000 to finance floating rate Eurodollar bonds, okay, Eurodollar loans. So what is a Eurodollar? A Eurodollar is a deposit of US dollars in a bank located outside of the US. All right, a deposit of US dollars in a bank located outside of the US. Why is it located outside of the US? Where is Bank A? Bank A is in the UK, okay? So they want to raise $10 million. They have a floating rate loan, okay? So they have two options. They can look at a 5-year fixed rate Eurodollar bond at 10%, or they can issue floating rate notes at LIBOR to finance the floating rate loan. What is LIBOR? London Interbank Offer Rate. London Interbank Offer Rate. That is the rate at which banks will transact. Okay, interbank. It's an interbank rate. Now, depending on the riskiness of someone wanting to transact, LIBOR can be the base rate, and there can be a premium on top of that. So this is a bank. They can issue notes at LIBOR. Now, Bank A. So they have two options: a fixed rate bond, or a floating rate bond. Okay? Note, whatever. What is their loan in terms of? Is their loan floating or fixed rate? So they want to raise $10,000, okay, to finance what? Floating rate loans. Okay, so they want to raise $10 million to finance floating rate loans. So in other words, they have this obligation that they want to raise money to finance something that has a floating interest rate. Right? Yeah? So do you think they would prefer a fixed rate loan or a floating rate loan? Okay, so if they've got floating rate obligations, if they've got a floating rate, they want to finance a floating rate loan. Okay, so the rate could go up and down or up and down. So to finance that, do you want something that also goes up and down? Okay, well, if you've got a fixed rate, you're financing with a fixed rate, but you're going to have a lot more debt. Sorry, you're going to have a lot more risk. Whereas if you've got two rates that go up and down at the same time, so your liability and your asset match, right? So as they go up and down together, that's better than if you've got an asset that goes up and down and a liability that's fixed. You see that? Okay. You sure? Is that all right? Okay, so what will blank A prefer? They would prefer floating rate. Because they've got a floating rate asset, they're going to want a floating rate liability. So we can match them. Okay. Company B is a triple B rated US company. They also need $10 million US dollars. They would prefer to borrow at a fixed rate. And they've got two options. So there's a 5-year fixed rate euro-dollar bond at 11.75, or they can raise the money by issuing 5-year floating rate notes at LIBOR plus 0.5%. Okay, so Company B prefers a fixed rate and Company A prefers a floating rate. All right? In the next, so they would prefer to borrow at a fixed rate. In the next slide, we've got just this is just a summary of what's going on. Okay, so you might want to. Okay, so Bank A has got two options: 10% fixed or LIBOR floating. Company B can borrow at 11.75% fixed or LIBOR plus 0.5. All right. So which bank has better loan options? Which bank can which of A and B can borrow at a lower rate? A can borrow at a lower rate. Why can A borrow at a lower rate? Very good. So A is a triple A rated bank. What is B? Triple B rated. In other words, B is riskier than A. So B will have to borrow at a higher interest rate because they are considered more risky. Okay. So we say that Bank A has an absolute advantage in borrowing relative to Company B. What does that mean? It means that the rates that Bank A can get are lower than the rates that Bank B can get. So if A wants to borrow, they can borrow at they can repay lower interest. Okay, so they can borrow at a lower interest rate, so they have an absolute advantage. Bank B has a comparative advantage in borrowing floating. Okay, so if you look back on slide 11, so for Company B to borrow fixed, they would have to pay 1.75% more than Bank A, right? Their rate that they need to borrow at is 1.75% more. What about for floating? 0.5, okay? So the difference between the rates at which they can borrow is not the same for a fixed or a floating rate loan, okay? So Bank B, Bank B has a comparative advantage in borrowing floating. So if Bank B borrows floating, it's going to have to pay 0.5% higher than Bank A. However, if they borrow fixed, it's going to have to pay 1.75% more. So A has an absolute advantage. A can always borrow at a lower rate. For Company B, relative to Company A, then they've got a comparative in terms of borrowing floating. So the premium they have to pay is less if they borrow floating. Now, the two together can borrow more cheaply if Bank A borrows fixed and Company B borrows floating. All right, how does that work? Well, imagine that what they're going to do is they're going to try and combine their borrowing costs. Now, remind me again, so Company B, they wanted to borrow what? Company B wanted to borrow fixed and Company A wanted to borrow floating. Okay, so if they do that, then Company B will borrow at a fixed rate of 11.75, Bank A will borrow at LIBOR. So together they will borrow at LIBOR plus 11.75. Okay. If they did the other thing, so if they borrowed in the way they did not want to borrow, Company B would borrow at LIBOR plus 0.5 and Bank A would borrow at 10%. All right. So together they would borrow at LIBOR plus 10.5. So in which scenario are they better off? Borrowing at their preferred method or borrowing at the other method? The other one, okay. So what can they do? If they borrow in the way they don't want to, they can then swap. They can then swap the borrowings, okay. The net savings would be 1.25%, okay, the difference between those two options. So how can they swap their debt obligations? They can do this by going to a swap bank, all right, by swap bank. So a swap bank can facilitate the swap. Why do they want to swap? They both have a preference for the type of loan they want. Okay? They both have a preference for either fixed or floating, but it's actually cheaper for them to borrow the other kind of debt. Right? So it's cheap. So Bank A would prefer to borrow at LIBOR, but it's cheaper combined for them to borrow fixed. Yeah? Are we doing okay? Do you want me to explain again? We're looking very confused. Do you want me to explain again? Okay. So we have two entities, two companies, A and B, right? They can both either borrow fixed or they can borrow floating. Yeah? Because of the type of, they have a preference for one or the other. They have a preference for fixed or a preference for floating. Right? It's also, so what we can do is we can look at them both together and see what is the best combination of what they should do. Right? So Bank A wants to borrow floating and Bank B wants to borrow fixed. Right? If they do that, then the combined cost of those loans is going to be LIBOR plus 11.75, right? So that's if they do what they want to do. So Bank A borrows floating, Bank B borrows with a fixed rate. What about if we look at the other option? If we look at the other option, then Bank B borrows floating and Company B borrows floating, Bank A borrows fixed, right? That is not what they want to do. That's the opposite of what they want to do, all right? So, however, if they take out the loan in the way that they don't want to, they will end up better off. Yeah? Why are they better off? Because the loan is cheaper if they do what they don't, if they take the loan they don't want. Okay, so obviously everyone wants to borrow at a lower rate. So these two companies have a problem because they want to borrow in one particular way, but it's actually cheaper for both of them if they do the opposite of what they want to do. So wouldn't it be good if they could borrow and then swap, right? So one could borrow fixed and swap. One could borrow floating and swap. Is that all right? Slightly better? So how can we get them to swap? How can we get them to swap the loans? We're going to go to the swap bank, all right? So the swap bank will come up with a deal for each of those for Bank A and Company B. Okay. So the swap bank says to Bank A, you pay LIBOR minus 1/8%, and we will pay you 10.3%, and we'll pay you 10.75%. Okay? So, what is happening with Bank A? They are swapping a floating rate loan for A, and they're receiving a fixed rate loan. Okay, so they're swapping. They are going to pay the swap bank floating, and they're going to receive fixed. Okay, where do these numbers come from? Where do the rates come from? They're given by the swap bank. Okay, so I wouldn't ask you to work out those rates. Those would be given. That is the deal that the swap bank makes. Okay, so why would A want to enter into this swap? Well, we already know that it is cheaper for Bank A to have a fixed rate debt. Yeah, a fixed rate debt at 10%. That's what so if Bank A borrows at 10%, so we know that that's what they can do. So they can borrow at 10%. How can they pay that 10% loan? This is 10% fixed. What they do is they take the 10.38% that they get from the swap bank to pay the fixed loan. Okay? And instead, they will pay the swap bank LIBOR minus 18. So what they've done is they have swapped a fixed rate for a floating rate. And that's what they wanted, right? They wanted to borrow at a floating rate. Okay. So why is this swap desirable for Bank A? Well, basically, at the end of the day, after all of these transactions happen, Bank A will pay LIBOR minus 0.5%. Where did that come from? Okay, so Bank A is going to receive 10.375% from the swap bank, and they're going to pay 10%. How much has A got left over? They've got 3/8. They are going to receive 3/8% after those two transactions. They then are going to pay back swap bank at LIBOR minus 1/8. Yeah? Okay? So they're going to end up with 3/8. They're going to pay back LIBOR minus 1/8. So the 3/8 that they're receiving minus LIBOR minus 1/8 that they're paying ends up with LIBOR minus 0.5. Can we see where that comes from? Can we see where those numbers come from? Okay, so with the swap, Bank A pays LIBOR minus 0.5. Right? If Bank A had borrowed swap themselves, how much would they pay? LIBOR. Which is a better deal? The swap, right? So A is better off under the swap. Okay, so that's Company A. So what Company A has done is they have swapped a fixed rate for a variable rate, a floating rate. So what's happening with, okay, so basically they're going to be 0.5% or better. What's happening with Company B? So the swap bank says to Company B, you pay us 10.5% per year, and we will pay you LIBOR minus 0.25. All right? So basically Company B is swapping a fixed for a floating rate. Okay? Company B, remember, what they were going to do was they were going to borrow at the floating rate. And they were going to borrow at LIBOR plus 0.5. So what do? They're going to pay 10.5% and receive LIBOR minus 0.25, and with that they're going to pay their LIBOR plus 0.5 debt. So what they've done is, so Company B would rather pay a fixed rate, okay, but they've borrowed at floating, they've borrowed at the floating rate, swapped with the swap bank, and ended up with a fixed rate loan. Why would Company B do this? Well, they will pay 11.25% fixed. Where does that come from? They're receiving LIBOR minus 0.25, they're paying LIBOR plus 0.25. Okay? So there's 0.75% that Company B is paying from this transaction. Yeah? There's a difference of 0.75% between what they receive and what they pay in terms of LIBOR. They then also pay the swap bank 10.5%. So in total, Company B pays 11.25%. How much would company B have paid if they were going to directly borrow fixed? 11.75. So with the swap, they're only paying 11.25, right? So company B is better off by 0.5%. So they're better off in the swap. Okay. Well, why would the swap bank do this? Why would the swap bank do this? So does the swap bank make money? So why don't you have a look at how much the swap bank would have made through these two swaps? Can you calculate that? So they're paying some, they're receiving some. Okay? How much do they have in total? All right, so the swap bank makes 0.25%. Did you get that? Yeah, so they're receiving 10.5, paying out 10 3/8. Yeah, so how much are they making or losing on that transaction? They're making 1/8 from this transaction. Here they're receiving LIBOR minus 1/8 and paying LIBOR minus 1/4. Yeah. So the swap bank makes 0.25%. How much does bank A save? 0.5%. Company B, 0.5%. So everybody has saved on this transaction, right? So the total savings, the total savings are 0.5% from company A, bank A, 0.5% from company B, and 0.25% from, which is what the swap bank makes. So the total saving from this swap is 1.25%, and that's what we call the quality spread differential, the QSD. All right? The QSD is made up of the difference between the company B. The differential is the QSD is the differential between the fixed rates between the two companies and the floating rates between the two companies, and then we take the difference between those. Right? Now, what is this thing? The quality spread differential is the gain from swaps, from the swap that can be shared between all of the counterparties. So between bank A, company B, and the swap bank. In this case, A and B made 0.5%, right? And the swap bank made 0.25%. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So one party might end up with less of a saving than the other. In that example, we might expect that maybe company B would not be as well off, okay, would not make such a big savings. Why? Because they were more risky than company A. Their creditworthiness was not as good, right? So what's happened with the interest rate swap? Basically, each company has ended up with the type of loan that they want, okay? But they've actually managed to borrow at the cheaper rate for themselves, and then swapped, and everybody ends up better. Okay? Is that all right? The second type of swap is a currency swap. Okay. So what happens here is that a company would enter into an agreement to swap debt in two different currencies. So we're going to look at we'll look at a fixed rate debt, for example. So a US multinational company called Gaggle Company wants to finance a £10 million expansion of a British plant. All right. So US multinational company, where are they based? In the US, all right? So they could borrow in the US and then exchange for pounds to finance their expansion. What's the advantage here? The advantage is that in the US, they're a US company, so they might be able to get a better deal from the US banks, right? So they're a US bank, so they're a US company. it's going to be easier for them to raise money in the US. What's the disadvantage? They're going to have to convert to pounds. And if this is a longer term project, there's exchange rate risk there. Okay? Alternatively, they could borrow pounds. Okay, they could borrow pounds, but what's the problem? They're a US company, so if they want to borrow pounds, they're not going to be as well known in the international market than in their home market. So they might need to pay a higher interest rate if they want to borrow in pounds. Okay. So what's the advantage? The advantage is if they borrow directly in pounds, they don't face the interest rate risk. Okay. Now, what if they can find a British company that's got the same financing need? With a mirror image financing need. Okay, so basically, what if they could find a US company that needed to raise, what if they could find a British company that needed to raise dollars? That company is going to face the same problem, right? They will be better off borrowing in the UK, but they've got a dollar debt, right? So they've got the same problem, just in the other currency. Okay, so what could they do? We could swap. We could enter into a swap transaction. Okay, let's assume the current exchange rate is $1 per pound. So what do they need? They need to find a British firm wanting to finance a dollar borrowing of $16 million. Okay, obviously we're keeping the maths nice and simple here, right? In the real world, it might not match as perfectly. Okay, so let's see. So both of them want to finance projects of the same size. What are their borrowing options? Okay, so Company A is a US company. So they would be better off borrowing in the US than in the UK, right? But they have a UK denominated debt, or they want pounds, right? Company B is in the UK, all right? So Company B wants to have a US debt. Okay, so how would the swap work? Company A is the more creditworthy of the two. So Company A would pay 8% less in terms of dollars. They would pay 8% less on a US loan, and they would pay 0.4% less to borrow in pounds. So in other words, it's always cheaper for Company A to borrow than Company B. In other words, Company A is more creditworthy, right? So A has an absolute advantage in borrowing in both cases. For Company B, they pay 2% more if they borrow in dollars and only 0.4% more if they borrow in pounds. So B has a comparative advantage in borrowing pounds. Right. So what do they want to do? Well, since B has a comparative advantage in borrowing pounds, B wants to borrow in dollars, right? But it's cheaper for them to borrow in pounds, because they're a UK company. So what we want to do is we want to enter into a swap where we swap a pound debt for a dollar debt. Yeah? Okay, and a dollar debt for a pound debt. So what would that look like? Well, so exactly the same as the interest rate swap. The swap bank will offer these two banks some swap terms. So Company A will be better off borrowing in the US, okay, in US dollars. However, they would prefer to borrow in pounds. So swap bank says we will lend you, we will enter into agreement with you where we provide you with 8% in a dollar denominated loan, but you will return to us 11% in a pound denominated. Okay, so with that 8%, Company A can pay off their dollar debt, and they end up actually on balance with a pound denominated debt of 11%. If Company A had borrowed in pounds, what would the rate be? If Company A had borrowed in pounds themselves, what would the rate be? 11.6. Okay, so under the swap, what is the rate? 11. So company A is better off under the swap. Yep. Company B would prefer to borrow in pounds, right? Sorry, would prefer to borrow in dollars, but it's cheaper for them to borrow in pounds. So the swap bank says, we will pay you at a pound interest rate of 12% and swap that for a dollar denominated interest rate of 9.4. Okay, so from the swap bank they receive 12% pound debt, which they then use to pay off their pound debt, right? And then they pay the swap bank 9.4% in US dollar denominated debt. If company B had borrowed in US dollars, how much would company B have paid? They would have to have paid 10%. What are they paying under the swap? 9.4%. So company B is better off, right? In this example, what is the QSD? Well, the QSD, remember, it's the difference between the rates. So 2%, the difference between the dollar-denominated debt, and 0.4, the difference between the pound-denominated debts. Okay, and the difference between those, that's the QSD. Okay, so A's net position is to borrow at 11, and they save 0.6. B's net position is to borrow at 9.4, and B saves 0.6. Okay, the swap bank also makes money, right? So how much does the swap bank end up with? Well, they've got the dollar-denominated debt, they end up with 1.4%, okay, that they're receiving. The pound-denominated debt, they are paying 1%, all right? So the difference is going to be 1.4% on the $16 million debt, minus 1% of the £10 debt, okay, which obviously we will then multiply by the spot rate. So basically, the swap bank is going to be better off. Now, this was a 5-year loan. Okay, so pretty much the swap bank ends up with $64,000 every year for the 5 years through this swap. Okay, so what is the overall savings? Well, A saves 0.6, B saves 0.6, and the swap bank saves 0.4. Okay, so 4% minus 1%. So the QSD is 1.6% overall. There is a bit of risk, however, for the swap bank because they're going to face exchange rate risk, right? Because they've got debt denominated in pounds and in dollars. So depending on what the exchange rates are, that's going to impact on, do they actually make $64,000 per year? But the bank could themselves enter into another transaction, another swap, to get rid of that that currency, that exchange rate risk. Is this one okay? Yeah. All right. So we've looked at some straightforward swaps. We looked at a fixed for floating swap. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to look like that. It could be a fixed rate for a fixed rate, floating for floating. It could be an amortizing swap. So an amortizing swap is where the principal in each period decreases over time. Right? So these are maybe a swap for 5 years, say. So in an amortizing swap, it could be maybe like the first year is a swap on $1 million, the second is $800,000, the third is $600,000, and so forth. We've just looked at a fixed for floating interest rate swap, so it could be a zero for floating. So a zero swap would be where the principal is only paid at the end, so there's no interest payments over the life of the swap. Floating, it could also be floating for floating. Okay. Another thing about swaps is that the company wouldn't necessarily swap the cash flows that occur between the parties would just be the difference between the two rates. So they wouldn't necessarily pay $11,000 and receive $8,000. They'd just pay the difference. So when they settle these. In order for a swap to be viable, there's got to be a QSD. So there's got to be some way where there can be a saving that can be divided between the parties to the swap. Beyond that, swaps can be developed in any way, right? So creativity is the only limit. What about if you want to come out of a swap? So what happens if, for example, we've got the swap between company A and company B. It's for 5 years. So every year we would see that the interest being paid and received. What if company A decided that they didn't want to be part of the swap anymore? Okay, so how would they do that? Well, then they need to work out what are the remaining cash flows that we would have to pay for the remainder of the 5 years. Right? So what would be the cash flows for the remainder of the 5 years? Calculate the present value of those. If it was a currency swap, then convert back to the home currency. All right. So payment of that amount then terminates the swap. So if one of the parties wanted to get out of the swap, that's how they would. So basically, they would pay out the remaining payments. Is that all right? Okay. Well, that's it for swaps. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we will go through the exam questions. Now, we'll have a look at these practice multiple choice. So what I've given you is I've given you 30 multiple choice questions because you haven't had much practice with multiple choice. So what I'll do is I would actually like you to attempt them first. So I'll give you 15 minutes to go through the first ones, and then we can go through maybe question 1 to 10 together. I'll give you another 50 minutes and do it like that. Okay, so you have time to practice. All right, so let's do that. All right, so the first question is talking about a fixed exchange rate regime. So what does a fixed exchange rate regime mean? It means that the currency will be fixed to another currency. Yep. So what would be the answer to number 1? Yep, so number 1 would be C. All right. So when you have a fixed exchange rate regime, what's the advantage? The advantage is that you don't have that exchange rate uncertainty, right? Because your rate is fixed. Okay, question 2. If the exchange rate between the Australian and the US dollar is expressed in direct quotation from an Australian perspective. Okay, so if it is direct from an Australian perspective, that means that the rate is going to be AUD per USD, right? Okay. So a rise in exchange rates. So a rise in exchange rates would mean is it A or B? A. Yep. So a rise in exchange rate means that you're going to get more Australian dollars for $1 US, which means that the US dollar has appreciated. So it's going to be A. Good. Okay, question 3. If the Australian dollar US dollar exchange rate declines from 1.25 to 1.2430, then the fall is equal to A, B, C, D? It's 70 points, right? So remember that 1 point is equal to 0.0001. Yep, so if it's gone up by 70, so 0.070, we'd say that's gone up by 70 points. Yes? Okay. Question 4. Bank XYX quotes 1.25 to 1.2550 for the Australian US dollar exchange rate to customer. What is the price at which the customer can buy 1 unit of the Australian dollar? Okay, so we've got 1.25, 1.225. So this is AUD per USD. So what does this quote mean? It means for $1 US, that is the amount of Australian dollars that I can get. Okay, but this is asking for the price at which a customer can buy 1 Australian dollar. Okay, this quote is in terms of 1 US dollar. So we can transform this rate into an Australian dollar per US dollar rate. Yep. Oh dear. That's US dollars per Australian dollars. Okay, so if the customer can buy 1 unit of the Australian dollars, that means the bank is selling. So do we want the bid or the ask price? We want the ask price. So it's going to be A, B, C, D? C. Yeah, it's going to be C. So the rate at which they're going to be able to buy 1 unit is going to be this rate. And as a check, we know that the customer is always going to pay more and receive less, right? Okay, you don't need to worry about question 5. The answer is B to question 5. Okay, I'll put that up. But as I said, I don't think I taught you that, so we'll move straight along to question number 6. Which of the following items is not a flow? A, B, C, D? D. D is not a flow. Why is D not a flow? The foreign currency and gold reserves at the Reserve Bank, that's actually the amount of the reserves, right? The flow is the change in those reserves. Good. Question 7. The balancing item appears on the balance of payments to A, B, C, D? What is the balancing item? The balancing items is errors and omissions, or also called statistical discrepancies, yeah? Okay, so that's our balancing account. Good. The sale of foreign bonds. So if we sell a foreign bond, what's that going to do to the amount of currency we have? Foreign currency we have. Will we have more or less? We'll have more foreign currency, so what would the answer be? It will be, yep, an increase in the supply of foreign currency. Yeah. So if we have, if we sell a foreign asset, that's gonna increase the amount. It's gonna increase the amount of foreign currency that we have. If I sell something in another country, I'm gonna have US dollars. So if I sell something in the US, what will I have? I'll have US dollars. Yeah. Okay. If you sell something, what's that going to do to the currency? So if I sell this pen for $5, then I no longer have a pen, but I now have I now have money. Sorry?
There was less money in the market.
If I sell something, how can there be less money in the market? If I used to own a bond and I've sold it, then I've received. This is probably not a very well written question, right? So maybe a way to think about this: if I was, for example, if the Australian government sold a foreign bond, what would that do? You can think about it as an Australian company is issuing a foreign bond. So that would lead to them receiving more foreign currency. Maybe that would be a better way of writing the question, right? If an Australian company issued a foreign bond. Would that make it more clear? You could think about it that way. You could think about it that way. All right. My questions in the exam are much more clear. Means what? So if I owned if I owned a bond and then I sold it, what would that mean for the currency? Can we move on? All right, question 9. The US inflation rate is lower than the Australian rate by 5%, according to relative purchasing power parity. Use the approximate version of PPP. Now, in your exam, unless you're specifically told to use the approximate version, please always use the exact versions of our parity equations, okay? So in this question, they're asking you to use the approximate version. Unless it specifically says that, please use the real version of the parity condition. Okay. Yes. No. So there is no formula sheet. So I did tell you that last week. There's only like 10 formulas in the whole course so far anyway. So it's not that. It's not too. No. It's fine to ask that question. So there's no formula sheet. No. Okay, question 9. US inflation rate is lower than the Australian rate by 5%. Then the Australian dollar should depreciate by 5%, which would be A. Okay. If we were going to use the exact one, it wouldn't be exactly 5%, right? It will be less than 5%. Because I've told you to use the approximate version, it's going to be 5%. All right, if the foreign currency equivalent of the domestic price of a commodity is less than the foreign price of the same commodity, then LOP, what is LOP? Law of one price. So what does LOP say? The law of one price says that the domestic price of a good should be equal to the spot price times the foreign price. Okay, so here what have we got? The domestic price in terms of the foreign price is less than the foreign price. Yeah? So is the foreign currency overvalued or undervalued? It's overvalued. It's overvalued. So if the law of one price was holding, if I took the domestic price divided by the spot price, that would be equal to the foreign price, right? Here the foreign price is more, so that means that the currency it's too much, right? So it's overvalued. Yes, no, maybe? Yes? All right. I think most of you are somewhere around question 11. So let's pause and I'll let you keep going and then we'll go through. Question 11. If the interest rate differential and the forward spread are positive and equal. Okay, so what is this? This question is referring to interest rate parity, right? So interest rate parity says F minus S over S is equal to... Now what I'm going to do is, here we're talking about domestic and a foreign currency. So let's call the domestic one I and the foreign one I star, the interest rates, okay? 1 plus I star. So first of all, so this is saying the interest rate differential, what's that? That's this part. The forward spread is this part, right? So the interest rate differential is positive. So if the interest rate differential is positive, that means that the interest rate domestic is more or less than the interest rate foreign. More, okay? So our domestic interest rate is going to be higher, okay? So I is going to be greater than I star. Now, remember the way that our interest rate parity is written is it's going to be the forward of currency A in terms of currency B, AB, AB. Okay, so in this case, A is going to be domestic and B will be foreign, right? So if we have a positive forward spread, that means that F minus S is positive, Yeah? So that means in the future, we will get more or less of currency A. We will get more of currency A, which is the domestic currency, per unit of the foreign currency. Right? So that's what the forward the forward spread, positive forward spread means, right? So has the domestic currency increased or decreased in value? Okay, so we've got, let me write this. Let me write this better. So we've got domestic per foreign, domestic per foreign, domestic per foreign, right? So if F minus S increases, that means the amount of domestic currency per unit of foreign currency has increased or decreased? Increased, right? So the amount of domestic currency, so let's say that it's gone from 2 Australian, so if we've got Australian dollars per US dollar, if it goes from 2 minus 1, for example, right? That would be positive, wouldn't it? Okay, so am I getting more or less of the domestic currency? Has the Australian dollar depreciated or appreciated? It's depreciated, right? Because I'm getting more of it in the forward market. So, so which one? So what's the answer going to be? The answer will be D, right? So the interest rate will be higher in the domestic country, so that'll be forward on the interest rate differential, and the domestic currency will sell at a discount. That will be this part, positive. Okay. Question 12. Suppose you observe the following direct spot quotations in New York and London. You've got $1 million. All right. So I've got $1 million. $1 million. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, is there a locational arbitrage? Well, so what's the first thing I'm going to do? Well, I'll convert them to pounds, right? So I can convert them to pounds. Would I rather convert them to pounds in London or in New York? Okay, so alright, so let's have a look. So in New York, it's going to be pounds 0.79, 7962 or 80 per dollar, and in London it's going to be 0.8 or 0.8050 per dollar. Now remember, when you've got a bid and an ask, the bid and the ask rates swap over when you're taking the direct. Thank you. Okay, so would I rather sell them in New York or in, would I rather, for $1 million, would I rather receive a rate of 0.8 or 0.79? I'd rather receive at 0.8, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transact in London, yeah? So then I could end up with £800,000, right? So I could then take my £800,000 and then I can convert them back to dollars. Would I rather pay 0.8 or 0.805? 0.8? So how many dollars will I end up with? 1 million. So my arbitrage? 0. So there's no arbitrage opportunity, so it's going to be B. What happened here? Why was there no arbitrage opportunity here? Because it's eaten by the bid-ask spread, right? So any arbitrage opportunity is you lose it from the bid-ask spread. Yeah? Did you get that one? That one was a bit tricky. Okay, 13. The dollar Deutschmark exchange rate is 1 Deutschmark to to $0.35. The Deutsche Mark franc exchange, we've been given the Deutsche Mark franc exchange rate, so we've got to calculate the franc per dollar. Okay, so we've got dollars per Deutsche Mark, and we've got Deutsche Mark per franc. Okay, and we asked for franc per dollar. All right, so how are we going to do that? I mean, there's a couple of ways we could do that. So we could multiply the two rates and then take the reciprocal. If we multiply the two rates, we're going to end up with dollars per francs, right? Which would be 0.35 times 0.31. So then to get francs per dollars, it's going to be 1 over. Okay, so it's going to be D. Yes? Can you see okay? Do you want me to make it a bit bigger? Up the back? Can you see okay? Did we get that? Very good. Okay, number 14. American terms refers to what? A, B, C, D, E? So remember, we've got, we didn't talk about this very much in class, but we can quote in terms of different currencies, right? So we could take like Australian dollars per euro, we could take euro per Australian dollars. There are quotes that are called American quotes and European quotes. An American quote is talking about the number of US dollars per unit of foreign currency. It's just a definition of how that's how that quote is given. Okay, number 15. In a freely floating exchange rate system, if the capital account is running a deficit, what does that mean, first of all, about the current account? The capital account is in deficit, then the current account must be surplus. Okay, so the current account must be in surplus. The balance of payments must be, so balance of payments is always, the balance of payment account must always balance, right? So it's always going to be 0, so what is the answer? So the answer is, so B and C are both correct, so the answer is D. Okay, question 16. A nation saves less than it invests in its economy. A nation saves less than it invests in its economy. So, right, how to think about this one? If a nation saves less than it invests in its economy, that must mean that it must be borrowing from outsiders, right? So it must be borrowing from outsiders. Okay. But this is talking about the current account, right? If we borrow from outsiders, where would that show up? That would show up in the capital account, right? So the capital account is going to be in, it's going to be a, so remember that the capital account is foreign inflow minus outflows. Okay. So if we're borrowing from outside, the foreign inflow must be increasing, which means our capital account must be in surplus. If our capital account is in surplus, that means that the current account must be in deficit, right? So that's going to be B. So you know, C is correct that they are borrowing from outsiders, but that is not. The question is specifically asking you about what's happening with the current account. Okay, so yes, if we've got a current account, a current account deficit, that must mean that we're borrowing from outside. But this is specifically saying what is happening in the current account. Yeah? Because the borrowing is going to hit the capital account, which then we'll see the opposite in the current account. Did you get that one? Yeah? Great, okay. So that one was, again, a little bit tricky. So I can assure you that the exam questions will also be tricky. Right? All right. According to interest rate parity, the currency of the country with the lower interest rate. So we had interest rate parity up here. So if the country has a lower interest rate, it will be selling at a forward premium discount, or it will be at equilibrium. A, B, or C? So it'll be selling at a premium, right? So with interest rate parity, lower interest rate means that your currency is going to appreciate. Yep. Okay, question 18. The current 5-year yen rate is 6% per annum compounding annually. The current US dollar rate is 8.5%. What is the implied forward premium or discount on the yen over the current spot rate for a 5-year forward contract? Okay, so again, we are using our, so we're being asked for the premium, right? So we're asked to calculate this, right? All right, so the premium is going to be the US dollar rate minus the yen rate divided by the yen rate. Now, these rates are for how long? 1 year. What are we asked about? What time period have we asked for? 5 years. So how am I going to make this 5 years? Take it to the power of 5. Okay. Which is 12.36%. Which is it going to be a premium or a discount? It's going to be a premium, right? Yeah. Do you get the same answer? You should get the same answer. Come and show me afterwards. Okay, so basically, in this course, if you get the right answer and you've used a different method, then yes, you can. Then I don't care how you come to the conclusion, the answer. If you get the same answer and you've used a different method, that's fine, right? In finance, there's not always only one way to answer a question. So if you use a different method and you get the same answer, that's fine. If you use a different method and you get a different answer, then maybe you want to think about your method. I'll zoom that in a bit more. All right, question 19. In a fully floating exchange rate system, if the capital account surplus for Australia rises, what will likely happen to the real value of the dollar? A, B, or C? If you've got a capital account surplus rising, so in other words, foreign inflow is going to increase, right, relative to foreign outflow. What's going to happen to the demand for Australian dollars? It will increase. So what will happen to the price? It should increase. Yeah? So it's going to be B. Okay, question 20. Suppose Lufthansa buys 10 Boeing 747s for $150 million in 2010, financed by a 5-year loan from the US Export-Import Bank. There's a 1-year grace period on interest payments. Okay, so Lufthansa is in Germany. Lufthansa is in Germany. Okay, they're buying from the Boeings from the US, right? So is this an inflow or an outflow from foreigners? If you are in the US, is it an inflow or an outflow? It's an inflow. So what's going to happen to the capital account? So the capital account should increase. Okay. Is this an export or an import? Okay, so it's an export. So what's that going to do to this isn't right. The capital account should decrease, right? Sorry, the capital account should decrease. Sorry. That was unhelpful. We go back to our balance of payments lectures. All right, I need to think about this one. So you keep going and we'll come back to number 20. All right, I'll give you 15 more minutes. Who's finished? Could you put your hand up if you finished? All right, I'll give you a couple more minutes. I'll give you some more time to keep going and we'll come back to this one, all right? All right, this question, what is this? In terms of the US, right? So they're buying 747s for 150 million, right? So is this an export or an import? It's an export. So if exports increase, what's that going to do to the current account? It's going to increase the current account, okay? So if the US is currently experiencing a trade deficit, what's that going to do to the trade deficit? It will decrease the trade deficit, right? So if you've got the current account is exports minus imports, right? If they currently are in deficit, that means imports are greater than exports. Yes? So if exports increase, that will increase the current account, okay? Or we could say that will reduce the trade deficit. Yeah? Okay? Yep, so that's going to be A. So if we've got the current account increasing, what's that going to do to the capital account? The capital account has to be decreasing, right? Because we've got the current account and capital account are opposites. Yeah? All right. What's it going to do to the balance of payments? What's it going to do to the overall balance of payments? So we've got an increase in the current account being offset by a decrease in the capital account. So what will be the net effect? 0. So the balance of payments should always be 0, right? Because remember, when we're talking about balance of payments accounting, every debit is offset by a credit, right? So then the effect on the balance of payments is going to be nothing. So A is right, B is right, and C is right. So the answer must be D. A, B, and C are all correct. Okay? All right, I'll give you a few more minutes to keep going. All right, question 21. Else we're going to run out of time, sorry students. Question 21. Which of the following is not a direct investment from the Australian balance of payments, A, B, C, D? Question 21. Should be? So here it's, remember, direct investment is about you don't have control, right? So the answer to that one is C. Question 22. If the Australian dollar US dollar exchange rate declines from 0.25 to 1.245, the fall is equal to A, B, C, D? A, yep. So again, we're talking about that points. Question 23. The following are the spot and the swap rates. Okay, so we can see here that we've got the forward rates, the forward points, sorry, we've got the spot rate and the forward points. The forward bid is greater than the ask, which means that the US dollar is selling at a forward discount, right? Because we've got to look at the bid and the ask. If the bid is greater than the ask, it means the currency is selling at a discount. Okay, 24 is a cross rate. So you've got dollars per lira, and you've got dollars per krona, and you've got dollars per lira. All right. So for the ask rate, it's going to be 0.1210 divided by 0.005. Okay, so don't forget with the bid and the ask that you're selling out of one currency and you're selling US dollars in one transaction and buying US dollars in the other transaction. All right, so just be very careful about which one you're using in terms of the bid and the ask. So that's 242, and the bid is going to be 0.1201 divided by 0.00051. I've left out a 0 there. Okay, which is 235.49. So the answer is C. Question 25. A deficit in of the merchandise trade account results in a current account what? Okay, actually we can't tell. The current account is made up of three things, right? Of merchandise trade, services, and unilateral transfers. If we only know about one of those things, we don't know what the overall effect's going to be on the current account. Pardon? It doesn't say that. It doesn't result in a current account. If everything else, ceteris paribus, if everything else remained the same, then yes, it would, but not necessarily because there are two other accounts in there. All right, question 26. The J-curve effect shows. So what happens to the current account with the deficit with the J-curve? Initially it goes down, and then it goes up. Okay, so we see an initial deterioration and then an eventual improvement, which is A. All right. Question 27. Suppose you observe the following rates. How can you best make money? Okay, I'm going to flip this page over. If you didn't get all of the answers, I will put them up on Blackboard, or you can get them from your friend. Okay, so how you can make money is that you're initially going to exchange $1 million for pounds. Then you're going to exchange pounds for euros, and then you're going to exchange euros for dollars. So 27 will be A. Yep. $28. You've got a spot and a forward rate quotation for Swiss franc. You're asked to calculate the 3-month forward premium per annum. Assume a 30-day month, 360-day year. Okay, so we've got F minus, this here. So you've got F minus S on S. So the forward is 0.88 minus the spot. So where is our forward rate? 3-month forward rate is this one. Yeah, 0.88. Right, the spot rate is 0.85 divided by the spot rate. Okay, then we're going to annualize this, right? Because you asked for the per annum rate. Okay, which is 0.1412. So question 28, is D. All right, so what this question said to you, what is the per annum rate? What is the premium per annum? Okay, so if this part here is just going to give you the 3 monthly premium, so you need to annualize that because it's asking for a per annum rate. Okay, you've observed these following rates. So what are you going to do? Okay, so here we have a covered interest arbitrage, right? All right, so what is the implied forward rate? Is the spot rate of 1.5 times 1.05, which is the US interest rate, divided by the pound interest rate. Okay, but the forward rate is 1.5 dollars per pound. Per euro, I think I put in. Goodness me, it's dollars per euro. Okay, so the forward rate is $1.5 per euro. It should be 1.53. So the euro is over or undervalued. The euro is overvalued because you should only get $1.53 per euro, but you're actually getting 1.5. So what do we want to do? Do we want to buy? We want to sell euro forward. Okay, so we're going to right. So we're going to start. So how can a borrow euro-based investor make money? Okay, now the way that the solution is written is a little bit different to what we've seen in the past, but that's okay. We can still do this. We can still do this. So we're going to borrow. How would we do this? We will borrow US 1,000. Okay, so we're going to have today and after 1 year. 1 year. Okay, so we're going to borrow $1,000 US. So today we're going to have 1,000 US. If we borrow $1,000 US, we're going to have to repay in a year at 5%. All right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to sell the euro equivalent forward, right? So we're going to then, so that will give us euros. So we're going to, we will receive 1050 US dollars, and for that we will pay 67742. This is US dollars. Or euros. Okay. So we're going to sell euros for US dollars. So we're going to receive those US dollars and then we'll use those to pay off our US dollar loan. Okay. We're then going to take our US dollar, our 1,000 US dollars that we've received today, and we're going to convert to euro today. 66660. So how am I going to manage to sell euros forward, right? So then I'm going to invest in Europe at 2.5%. So then I will, at the end of this, all right, so I had my 1,000 US dollars, I converted to euro, okay? So I'm going to invest in euro, I'm going to get 683.33. So my net profit will be in euro, and it will be about six euros, or €5.91. Yes. All right. This is a little bit different to how we've seen them today, but basically we need to work out which one's over or undervalued. and then we're going to sell the overvalued one forward. Okay? Finally, question 30, purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity provides the cost of a haircut in Columbia, Missouri should be the same as the cost of a haircut in Hong Kong. Is that correct? Why not? It's a non-tradable good. Very good. The rate of inflation must be the same everywhere? No. Spot exchange rates are the best predictor of expected inflation rates? No. Cost of Big Mac sandwich should be reflecting the cost of 2 all-beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun? No. So the answer must be? None of the above. Very good. Okay, so I will put these solutions up. I'll put these solutions up soon, not before Wednesday because we have another class on Wednesday. So, students, can I have your attention please for a little bit longer? Can I have your attention please for a little bit longer? Thank you. So we do not have class next week. Your mid-semester exam is on Wednesday. Consultation will be different this week and next week. So please check Blackboard if you have questions. So feel free to come see me consult. I will see you on Wednesday at the exam, 5 o'clock. Please make sure you go to the correct room. So check Blackboard if you don't know where you're supposed to be going. All right?